It's only week 6 of the fantasy football season, and it feels like every single week we are bombarded with a ton of major injuries. Now, we have a lot of options at the quarterback position, but which ones are we going to rely on in week 6? That's what we're talking about right now. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there. Welcome to the Week 6 Start and Sit video for the quarterback position. Now, before we get into every player, every matchup, there are a couple underdog pick'ems that I want to be sure that you have an opportunity to play. Now, maybe you don't have an underdog account already, and it's okay. It's not too late. Head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app. Create a new account. Use the referral code Headliners when you do so. But here's what's awesome. They're matching initial deposits up to $500. That's a lot of free money to play with. Now, no, you don't have to deposit $500, but they'll match that initial deposit all the way up to $500, and then you can play with some free money and have a great time with us. Just be sure to use referral code Headliners when you sign up for that new account. Now, there's 2 plays so far at the quarterback position this week that I'm going to lock in and play. The first one is Lamar Jackson. I'm going over 221.5 yards passing. He's got a great matchup going up against Tennessee this week, and he would have easily eclipsed that number once again last week if his wide receivers could have caught a few more balls. I expect them to fix that though here in week 6. I'm taking the higher on Lamar Jackson. I'm also doing the same thing for Matthew Stafford. I'm taking the higher of 271.5 this week for Matthew Stafford going up against the Arizona Cardinals at home. Cooper Kupp's second week back. We still have Puka Nacua. We have Tutu Atwell, and we have a Cardinals defense that gives up a whole lot of yardage. So if you want to play those with me, be sure to sign up for Underdog Fantasy right now using referral code Headliners. But let's go ahead and dive into all the matchups. The first one, Thursday Night Football, Denver Broncos, Kansas City Chiefs. And how crazy is it that after what we saw from Russell Wilson in Denver last year, now this year he's all of a sudden the quarterback 8 overall in fantasy. Now his defense going out each and every week and absolutely sucking is really turning Russell Wilson into a weekly viable fantasy option. He's scoring on average right now 19 fantasy points per game. And that's all despite him going back-to-back games now with less than 225 yards passing. What's really keeping him up there in that high scoring territory is touchdowns. He's had double-digit touchdowns now in 4 of the 5 games he's played this season and only has 2 interceptions on the year. Plus, a little bit of sporadic, like sprinkled in rushing upside every once in a while. He does have 2 games this year with at least 49 yards rushing as well. But this Chiefs defense is still playing pretty well. They're only allowing 14.8 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks and have only allowed over 250 yards passing in 1 game all season long. Now, Denver, fairly healthy. We know Javonte Williams is still banged up, but Jaleel McLaughlin going out there and looking like Javonte Williams. But I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. This Thursday night game doesn't give me that warm fuzzy on the inside. It's on the road in Kansas City against a good defense. Now, I do expect Denver to be losing in this game, which means Russ is all of a sudden going to have to throw the ball a lot. He's a little bit more of one of those high risk, high reward type plays for week 6. Now, his opponent, we know we start Patrick Mahomes each and every week, and let's hope that this is the breakout game that Mahomes really needs. He hasn't played bad. He's just played normal, average, I guess you could say. So far in 2023, he has a career low in yards per attempt, yards per completion, yards per game, and touchdown percentage. Now, between Travis Kelce being less than 100% healthy and all the wide receivers basically having a weekly mid-off, the ceiling just hasn't really been there for Patrick Mahomes like we've seen in the past. But he's still the overall quarterback 6 and is averaging 20.6 fantasy points per game. However, does now have back-to-back games with under 20 fantasy points. But don't worry, this isn't a Chicken Little, the sky is falling type scenario. Because like I said, he's going up against the Denver Broncos, and they allow 22.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is second most in the NFL. And an opponent hasn't scored less than 28 points on them in over a month. I'm liking what we could see from Patrick Mahomes. Hopefully, with Travis Kelce being somewhat limited here, majority of the week, it does sound like he's going to be able to go. Really wish it wasn't a short week this week for him, but it is what it is. Mahomes in prime time always finds a way to go out there and put points up on the board. We know we can't sit Patrick Mahomes. But that's going to take us to Sunday football. And I don't know about you, but the best way to go into Sunday football is by hip thrusting. But with so many injuries, I feel like the fantasy community needs a little bit of energy, so we're vigorously thrusting into Sunday football this week. And the first game up is going to be between the Baltimore Ravens and the Tennessee Titans. And what we really need to do is find a way for Lamar Jackson to catch his own passes. Is that possible? Because his wide receivers, they weren't catching him last week. 7 drops in week 5. No, that's not on the season. That's in week 5 alone. Multiple times they could have gone for big play touchdowns. It was a total killer to Lamar Jackson. Now in fantasy football, it is impossible to see the future. I don't care what anyone says. What we try to do here is predict opportunity. Because if a player is going to get opportunity, they have a bigger chance at fantasy points. That's what we really look at each and every week. Well, Lamar had it last week. I loved Lamar last week. I also loved Zay Flowers last week in that matchup. Then we know that Lamar Jackson wasn't helped out by his wide receivers. But what about Zay Flowers? I mean, he led the team with 11 targets. Didn't seem to matter because he tripped over his own 2 feet on a basically walk-in touchdown and missed the ball. Both those guys bombed despite having great opportunities, but now they get a matchup going up against Tennessee, who has been playing a little bit better in the secondary, but it was also up against an injured Joe Burrow and Gardner Minshew. So really don't know how much to really lead into those numbers. On the season, right now they're allowing 14.9 fantasy points per game. When we look at injuries here though, other than the wide receivers basically not having any hands, they're fairly healthy in Baltimore. Now, Lamar Jackson right now is playing crazy good football. His team let him down last week, but in no way am I sitting him once again in week 5. He's going to be playing. As for Ryan Tannehill, he is definitely someone that I will sit this week. It's Ryan Tannehill. He's the current quarterback 30 overall in fantasy football, averaging 11 fantasy points per game, only has 3 total touchdowns over 5 games this season. Now, I am glad that he's starting to utilize DeAndre Hopkins more and more after D-Hop has started to become a little bit more healthy. That's going to make Hopkins a weekly viable option in fantasy football. But it's not enough for Ryan Tannehill to be a weekly fantasy football viable option, especially in a matchup going up against Baltimore. They allow only 11.2 fantasy points per game. That's second fewest in the league. They have held opponents under 20 points in 3 of the 5 games this season and haven't allowed more than 216 yards passing in a game yet. Now, when it comes to injuries, yes, we're still missing Treylon Burks, but honestly, Treylon Burks never really done a whole lot in the league, so it's not like he's the missing piece to this passing offense. Now, we know after following Ryan Tannehill for many years that he's good enough to have a couple good games a year, but they're very few and far between, and it's not worth risking your fantasy football matchup by trying to be cute and starting Ryan Tannehill, so he is going to be somebody I don't consider in week 6. What about the next matchup? Let's go down to Washington and Atlanta. And for Washington, we got to talk about the game last week of Sam Howell. It was probably one of my better quarterback calls of the week because he had his best statistical game as a pro. Even though I for sure didn't see that game going the way that it did and Chicago jumping out to that huge lead, Sam Howell did end the game with 388 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, and is now quarterback 13 overall on the year. But it also took him a career high in pass attempts, 51. That's not something we can count on weekly. And he did all of it while basically ignoring his 2 best wide receivers on the team, Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. To put that into perspective, Logan Thomas himself had more targets than Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson combined. Now they're going up against Atlanta, who is a very good secondary. They're allowing only 15.9 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Overall, Washington fairly healthy, but it looks like an overall mess right now in this organization. They have a lot of talent. Their game plans, though, they look overly basic. Players look frustrated. And then on top of that, they're going to be playing on the road in Atlanta, where Atlanta hasn't lost a game yet this season. And like I mentioned, has a very good secondary. There is way more risk associated with Sam Howell this week than there was last week. For his opponent, Desmond Ridder. As much as I was wrong about Desmond Ridder just last week, there is still no way that I would be excited to start him this week. Prior to week 5, he had 3 games with 8 fantasy points or less and was the quarterback 28 overall. He had 4 total touchdowns through 4 weeks of the season, had never thrown for over 237 yards in an NFL game. However, in week 5, had 329 yards and 1 touchdown, and then also added a rushing touchdown. They also did just make a trade. They're bringing in Van Jefferson from the Los Angeles Rams. I love Van Jefferson. I am basically like a Van Jefferson truther. Do I automatically love this offense more with Van Jefferson? No, I don't. But they are going up against a Washington defense that is playing pretty freaking bad right now. They're allowing over 21 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and they've given up 30 plus points to opponents now in 4 straight games. Overall, the Falcons fairly healthy. I just can't sit here and overreact right away and say, well, Desmond Ridder did good last week, he's going to do good this week. That's not how fantasy football works. The risk with Ridder is going to remain high each and every week in fantasy football because you never know how that offense is actually going to produce. But this matchup, on paper, it really doesn't suck. Which will then take us over to Minnesota and Chicago, my Manscaped matchup of the week. That's right, have you been living under a rock if you haven't visited manscaped.com just yet? I know a lot of people think it's just hair trimmers, but it's not. They have something for everyone, and all you need to do is browse their site for a few seconds to find something that you could definitely use. But whatever you do, don't go out and pay full price. Be sure to use promo code HEADLINERS at checkout so you can get 20% off and free shipping. And yes, I'm looking forward to this matchup between Kirk Cousins and Justin Fields, even though it absolutely sucks that we're not going to have Justin Jefferson. And what does this offense look like without Justin Jefferson? Well, it's not like Kirk Cousins doesn't have other weapons. He still has Jordan Addison, KJ Osborne, TJ Hawkinson, and Kirk Cousins is still one of those quote-unquote safer options. He has 2+ touchdowns now in 5 straight games. He's the quarterback 4 overall and averaging just over 20 fantasy points per game, but I do expect this offense to be a little bit more balanced without Justin Jefferson. They're going to have to spread it around. However, they're still going to throw the ball a lot. Kirk Cousins has had 44 plus pass attempts now in 4 of the 5 games this season, and they need wins badly right now in Minnesota. We couldn't have asked for a better matchup, though, without Justin Jefferson. They're going up against Chicago, and Chicago allows 23 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is most in the NFL, and on the season, they're allowing over 31 points per game to opponents. Now, obviously, I've mentioned a few times here, I'm still hurting on the inside. Justin Jefferson added to the IR, going to be at least 4 weeks, which absolutely blows. But when it comes to Kirk Cousins, at least the floor is still fairly safe. This matchup is a really good matchup, and a team that needs to try and right the ship still has plenty of playmakers to do it. I'm looking for KJ Osborne to take a big step up in this offense. Still, honestly, if you look at the weapons that Kirk has between Addison and Osborne and Hawkinson, that's a better receiving group than like 7 other teams have in the NFL, and that's without Justin Jefferson. I still believe Kirk Cousins can put up some solid numbers. His opponent, Justin Fields. So you remember that quarterback that so many people wrote off or belittled the first couple weeks of the season? Yeah, well, he's currently quarterback 3 overall in fantasy football, averaging 21.2 fantasy points per game, and over the last 2 games combined, has 617 yards passing, 8 passing touchdowns, and 82 rushing yards. He's tied for 2nd in the league with 11 passing touchdowns, and has a top 12 overall passer rating. Now, for sure, I know the haters are going to be like, yeah, it's because he played Denver and Washington. I never say that he didn't, but he did exactly what he was supposed to do against poor teams, and now he gets a good matchup once again, going up against Minnesota, who allows almost 20 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks themselves, 9th most in the league. Now, his running game in Chicago, pretty banged up, right? We know Roschon Johnson dealing with a concussion. Khalil Herbert has a high ankle sprain. Travis Homer, he's dealing with a hamstring strain. So that's just going to open the door for Justin Fields to maybe have to run the ball a little bit more. And we love that in fantasy football. When this kid is playing like he is, you have to ride the wave. And like I've said all along, even to start the year, the guy wasn't playing great football, and he was still scoring on average 15 fantasy points a game. game. He did that in 2 of the first 3 games of the season when everyone was hating on him. I'm never going to underestimate a pro athlete with a little bit of confidence, and right now, we're definitely seeing that in Justin Fields, and he's going to be somebody inside my top 12 once again. How about now we head over to Cincinnati, though, for the Seattle Seahawks and Cincinnati Bengals. We'll kick it off with Geno Smith, who's fresh off his bye week, and hopefully they got some things figured out while they had their bye week, because Geno is currently the quarterback 26 overall, averaging only 14.2 fantasy points per game. He was beat up in the game right before the bye week, though, so hopefully he's had some time to heal. What's concerning to me here is he only has 1 multi-touchdown game on the season. And when you have an offense with the likes of DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith, and Jigba, that really shouldn't be the case. Touchdowns should be coming a little bit easier. Why aren't they? It's the success in the running game, right? It's really hurting the passing numbers. Geno's just not having to throw the ball a ton each week, only 1 game on the season with over 40 pass attempts. But now they get a matchup going up against Cincinnati. They allow 16.5 fantasy points per game, which is 18th, so almost middle of the pack. But those numbers could be skewed a little bit as well, because the last 2 weeks they've gone up against Josh Dobbs and Ryan Tannehill. Now overall in Seattle, fairly healthy. Offensive tackle Charles Cross, still questionable to play. He's definitely a name to pay attention to here throughout the week. But as crazy as it may sound, this has a lot to do with Joe Burrow. And you're like, why does Joe Burrow have anything to do with Geno Smith? If Joe Burrow can take what we saw in week 5 and continue that momentum and put some points on the board against the Seattle Seahawks, it's going to keep Geno throwing. If Seattle gets an early lead, don't be surprised if they rely heavily on the running game to keep the ball away from the Cincinnati offense. We're looking for this game to stay close, or for the Bengals to get an early lead so we can see Geno throwing the ball a little bit more if you need to depend on him. For his opponent, Joe Burrow, for Joe Burrow owners, Monday morning seemed maybe a little bit brighter. He's coming off by far his best game of the season, 317 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception, and actually had a 10-yard rush, and he looked pretty good when he was moving. He basically found Ja'Marr Chase whenever he freaking wanted to, and he did that without having T. Higgins in the game, who did not play in week 5. They also found a way to run the ball a lot, 25 carries with Joe Mixon on the ground. But now they get to go back home to Cincinnati, go up against Seattle, who allows 18.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is 12th most in the league. And we already know that Seattle is way easier to throw on than they are to run on. They've given up over 300 yards passing in 3 of the 4 games to start this season. Now, it's unclear whether or not we're going to have T. Higgins for this game or not, so be sure to pay attention to that. But this really is a step in the right direction for Joe Burrow with what we saw in week 5. This is what we've been talking about for weeks. I believe I've mentioned it on this show for multiple weeks now. I was okay if you had another option other than Joe Burrow in your starting lineup. But I didn't want people to get frustrated when that big game happened on their bench, because that should tell us that this is the time he's turned the corner and becomes a better fantasy start going forward. I'm hoping that's exactly what we saw in week 5 and that it doesn't backfire on us. But with the way we've seen him utilize Ja'Marr Chase while being injured, that's almost enough to keep him fantasy viable all by himself. What about the next game? We got the Cleveland Browns and San Francisco 49ers. And am I the only one that looks at Brock Purdy as basically like a matchup-proof type quarterback at this point? He has had 2+ touchdowns now in 10 of the 11 regular season starts that he's had. He's scored over 15 fantasy points now in all 11 of his regular season starts. He does it against good defenses. He does it against bad defenses. He has weapons everywhere with Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, Christian McCaffrey. They even give Brock Purdy goal line carries at times in this offense. And then on top of that, the guy's out there completing 70% of his passes. And how do we reward Brock Purdy? With a matchup this week going up against the Cleveland Browns, who are the #1 defense in the NFL as far as passing goes. Oh yeah, and they're coming off their bye week where they had an extra week to prepare for this matchup. They only allow 11.9 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is 3rd fewest in the league. Overall, though, San Francisco is pretty healthy, and I don't want to take anything away from this Browns defense because they've played great football so far here early in 2023. But they've faced the likes of Joe Burrow, who was hurt in week 1, Kenny Pickett, Ryan Tannehill, I mean, really, this may be a little bit more of a floor game for Brock Purdy, but his floor is still hovering right around 19 fantasy points per game, and I don't hate it whatsoever. His opponent, is it Deshaun Watson? Is it going to be PJ Walker? Is it DTR? Doesn't even matter. As of right now, we do not know if Deshaun Watson is going to play in week 6. We know they were on bye in week 5. He didn't play in week 4. But when you take into account that this matchup is going up against the San Francisco defense, I don't even know if I'd be pumped to start a healthy Deshaun Watson in this matchup, especially since their offensive line isn't exactly healthy either. We do need to wait and see whether or not he's going to play, but if he does, it will be a huge risk. And like I said earlier, it doesn't matter if he doesn't. PJ Walker, DTR, I'm not interested in starting anyone here this week right now in Cleveland. How about we go down to Houston now for the New Orleans Saints and Houston Texans? And we'll start it off with Derek Carr, who's coming off one of his better games of the season against New England. Even though New England didn't really seem to care too much, right? And Carr didn't have a huge game, 183 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, but he did look better in week 5 than he did in week 4 when playing through injury. So definitely pay attention to that. But the ceiling just isn't overly high. He's scored sub-double digits now in 3 of the 5 games this season and hasn't even scored more than 16 fantasy points in a game. Now he's going up against Houston, who allows how much? 16.7 fantasy points per game, thanks in large part to the week 5 performance of Desmond Ridder. It was the only 300-yard passing game that they have allowed so far this year in Houston. We also know that Derek Carr has multiple offensive linemen on the injury report. Juwan Johnson is questionable. There were talks about a pregame ankle injury this past week for Chris Olave. He played, but only had 5 targets, 2 catches, 12 yards and a touchdown, and I really want to see this offense get going. But with 3 straight weeks under 200 yards passing and only 3 total touchdowns, the risk is just way too high for me to be excited to start Derek Carr. What about CJ Stroud? I'm always a lot more excited about CJ Stroud because I'm anxious to see how good is this kid actually going to be. He's the current quarterback 14 overall in fantasy football, coming off a tough road game in Atlanta, still has not thrown an interception on the season. He's thrown touchdowns now in 4 straight, but week 5 was a little bit more of a floor game for CJ Stroud where he only scored 14 fantasy points. The one thing I've noticed though is how he thrives at home. In his 2 home starts, he's averaging 345 yards passing and 2 touchdowns a game. On the road, averaging 257 and 1 touchdown each game. It's like when they're playing at home, they're kind of showing him off for the home crowd or something, trying to energize that fan base, sell more tickets. I don't know what it is, but he definitely plays better at home. But now he gets a matchup going up against New Orleans, and on paper, it's not a great matchup. They allow only 13.9 fantasy points per game, 7th fewest in the league. But listen to some of the quarterbacks they've faced. Ryan Tannehill, Bryce Young, Jordan Love, Baker Mayfield, Mac Jones. I mean, give me CJ Stroud over all of those guys. Now, we know that the offensive line has been absolutely decimated in Houston for weeks, and they've been playing through it pretty well. But we're definitely going to be paying attention to the availability of Tank Dell, who suffered a concussion in week 5. Now, while this may not be one of those big-time ceiling games for CJ Stroud, it's definitely a better matchup than they leads on to be. A lot of people going to be scared off because of what those defensive numbers show for New Orleans. Not me. He's probably going to be inside my top 12 this week. Which will now take us down to Jacksonville for the Colts and the Jags, and it's not Anthony Richardson this week or for the next few weeks. We're going to be having Gardner Minshew under center for the Indianapolis Colts, and honestly, it sucks to lose Anthony Richardson. But is Gardner Minshew a plug-and-play quarterback with no Richardson in the lineup? Probably not. Not at least in 1 quarterback leagues, but that doesn't mean that this guy is absolutely useless. He may not be one of those weekly safe must-start guys, but that mustache has some damn power in it. But how crazy is it that he's going to get a start here this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, the team in which he started his career on the road in Jacksonville? Not a bad matchup either. The Jags allow 20.3 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That's 6th most in the NFL. We also know we're probably going to see a little bit more Jonathan Taylor this week as they work him back into some game action. Now, Minshew's not going to have that ceiling of Anthony Richardson each and every week, but if you play in a 2-quarterback league or a super flex league, Gardner Minshew is still an option for you here this week. I expect a lot of targets going the way of Josh Downs because whenever Gardner Minshew's under center, year, Josh Downs is his favorite target. And hey, if he can rack up some receptions along the way, it only helps that floor of Gardner Minshew. His opponent, it's going to be Trevor Lawrence. And we finally got to see a true glimpse of what this offense is kind of working towards in Jacksonville. Trevor Lawrence had his first 300-yard game of the season. Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk both finished top 24 at the position. Travis Etienne, he was among the top running backs in week 5, and they played against the Buffalo Bills defense. Now, with all of that said, we still need an uptick in touchdowns. He only has 5 touchdowns through 5 weeks, and that just is not enough to put him over the hump. Plus, he needs to, quit fumbling the damn ball. Trev, hold on to the ball. Pretend that thing is like some high-end hair product or something and hold on a little bit tighter. But he's going to have a chance for this to be one of those full-fledged bounce-back style games. Going up against Indianapolis, they allow 19.3 fantasy points per game. That's 10th most in the league. And we saw Trevor Lawrence already play this team this year, and he did pretty freaking good in week 1. 241 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. And really, we still don't know the availability of Zay Jones and whether or not he's going to play this week, technically still questionable. Now, Lawrence is about to enter a 3-week stretch where he has a chance to fully bounce back in some of these matchups. All signs are pointing for a great chance for that to start here in week 6 against the Colts, and I don't hate Trevor Lawrence this week. Which will then take us down to Miami for the Dolphins and the Panthers. And for Bryce Young, coming into week 5, he'd only had 2 touchdowns, hadn't thrown for more than 204 yards in a game. Then in week 5, had 247 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and despite that, he's still the quarterback 31 overall, averaging only 12.6 fantasy points per game. But was that the turning point of the season for Bryce Young? Or was that just due to the matchup going up against Detroit? There's really a lot to unpack in Carolina. The drama of who should they have drafted at number 1? For sure, it plays a part. They need to have him on the field and producing big numbers to save some jobs. And honestly, they're going to have another chance to do it this week against Miami. They allow 19.8 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That's 8th most in the league. But this is another team with a beat-up offensive line. We know that Miles Sanders, he's not 100% healthy yet, but overall, the pass-catching weapons, fairly healthy. This is going to be another situation similar to Desmond Ridder. I'm not going to overreact after one big game. I would really prefer not to. I want to see some consistency in this offense. Now, if you're looking for a decent low-end quarterback too, in those 2 QB Superflex leagues, it's a decent option for Bryce Young this week going up against Miami, where I fully expect Miami to get a lead and Bryce Young to have to throw the football. His opponent, Tua Tagovailoa. What's crazy here is that the Miami offense has had more yards than any other team in NFL history through the first 5 weeks of the season, but Tua hasn't absolutely been killing it each and every week. In fact, 3 of his 5 games this season have resulted in less than 20 fantasy points per game. But it's the big games that keep him as a weekly must-start. 7 of his 11 total passing touchdowns have come in just 2 games this season. This offense needs to remain in fantasy lineups each and every week, even in tougher matchups like this going up against Carolina. They allow only 14.3 fantasy points per game, 8th fewest. But we just saw Jared Goff go out there without his best wide receiver and be the quarterback 4 overall on the week against this same Carolina defense. Plus, it absolutely sucks, but another injury here, Devon Achane. He's going to be out for multiple weeks. Does this mean that we throw the ball maybe a little bit more in Miami because of that? He's just not a guy that should be sat with the offense that he plays in. They put up too many freaking points, and it's too big of a risk to sit the guy. But how about now we move down to Las Vegas for the Raiders and the Patriots, and we'll start off with Mac Jones. Because everything great that I just said about Miami, the complete opposite for the New England Patriots, right? They are the lowest scoring team now in the NFL, and there is literally nothing appealing about this offense whatsoever. Mac Jones doesn't even have 17 fantasy points over the last 3 games combined. I don't care about matchups. I don't care about injuries. There's no way I'm contemplating starting Mac Jones. His opponent, Jimmy G. And as we know, there's a lot of ties in the Las Vegas Raiders to the New England Patriots. We got Jimmy G, Jacoby Myers, their head coach, Josh McDaniels. But Jimmy G just continues to do Jimmy G things. He's not a bad quarterback. He just doesn't have a very high ceiling in fantasy football, and that offensive line isn't helping him at all. He's been sacked now 7 times over his last 2 games. But this offense in Las Vegas, it's just weird. They didn't actually start to feed Davante Adams any targets until late in the game in week 5. They're not overly utilizing Hunter Renfrow or either one of their tight ends. We saw Michael Mayer have some great plays, but the dude gets like 2 or 3 targets. Like, utilize that guy even more. I have no idea what they're doing in Las Vegas. Now they're going up against New England. And on paper, New England does pretty good against opposing quarterbacks despite their overall defense struggling. But on the season, they allow only 12.5 fantasy points per game, which is 4th fewest to the quarterback position. Overall, fairly healthy in Las Vegas for the most part. But the fact that Jimmy G still has more interceptions than touchdowns, I can't be overly comfortable starting him once again here in week 6. How about we go down to Tampa Bay for the Buccaneers and the Lions? Now we'll start it off with Jared Goff. And apparently the problem in this offense was Amon-Ra. Maybe they shouldn't have played him all season long, right? I mean, it should be clear to you. It's clear to me at this point, right? Because Jared Goff just scored more points than he has in any other game this season, and he did it without Jahmyr Gibbs or Amon-Ra St. Brown in the lineup. 236 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, and a rushing touchdown for Jared Goff. A rushing touchdown for Jared Goff. Now, a lot of the reason why Jared Goff continues to be safe each and every week has to be the emergence of rookie tight end Sam Laporta. He's able to move the chains. He's able to beat defenses for big plays down the field. But overall, this offense shouldn't be surprising anyone. They were one of the best offenses overall in 2022, but now they get a matchup going up against Tampa Bay on the road in Tampa Bay, who's coming off their bye week. And Tampa Bay only allows 14.6 fantasy points per game, 9th fewest in the league to opposing quarterbacks. Now we know that Jahmyr Gibbs and Amon-Ra St. Brown, they're still questionable. They're banged up a little bit, but Dan Campbell has already come out and said that he feels pretty good about Amon-Ra playing this week. As for Jahmyr Gibbs, I don't even know if it really matters or not, because when the kid was fully healthy, they weren't giving him very many touches anyway. Just an overall dumb situation there. But this won't be an easy task for them on the road against a solid defense that has had an extra week to prepare for them. But this is one of the most consistent offenses in all the NFL, and they haven't had a game yet this season where they've scored less than 20 points in a game. So overall, Jared Goff, probably not a horrible play. His opponent, Baker Mayfield. Are we in for a post-bye week bake show maybe? Because the last time we saw him on the field, it was his best game there before the bye, where he had 246 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception, and had 31 yards rushing against the New Orleans Saints. Then on top of that, he's scored at least 18 fantasy points now in 2 of his last 3 games played. Now, is Baker some weekly top 12 option? Not at all, but he does fit into that same group of like those solid quarterback 2 plays for everybody that plays Superflex or 2 quarterback leagues. In this matchup, going up against Detroit, they allow 18 fantasy points per game, and Bryce Young just had a great game against this defense just last week. The biggest injury to watch, though, has to be that of Mike Evans. With all the other injuries we've seen over the past couple weeks, a lot of people have forgotten about Mike Evans. He left that game prior to the bye with a hamstring injury and is still questionable. That is definitely something to pay attention to. But we got Baker at home, coming off a bye week with an extra game to prepare. Like I said, solid quarterback 2 for me this week, but would really love for him to have Mike Evans in order for him to reach that ceiling this week. Which will then take us over to LA for the Rams and the Cardinals, and we'll start off with Josh Dobbs. And damn it, Dobby, last week was your chance to shine, and honestly, he didn't play bad, but turnovers absolutely killed him. 2 interceptions and a lost fumble is just too much to overcome. He didn't have an interception coming into that game last week and then threw 2 just last week alone. Now, he does have multiple touchdowns now in 3 of the last 4 games played, but he also didn't run it all in week 5. The first game in a month without at least 40 yards rushing in a contest. Without that rushing upside, Josh Dobbs is not startable for most weeks in fantasy football. Now a matchup going up against the Rams. They allow 18.2 fantasy points per game, 11th most in the league, but they have the ability to force turnovers. And with what we saw last week in Arizona, that's a little bit worrisome. Plus, they just lost James Conner for multiple weeks, which means more pressure on the shoulders of Josh Dobbs. This could for sure lead to more running for Josh Dobbs, which is an absolute great thing, but it could also lead to more turnovers with trying to force things that he didn't have to earlier in the season because of James Conner, still a high risk in starting Josh Dobbs. As for Matthew Stafford, how awesome was it to not only get the return of Cooper Kupp, but to see him targeted immediately in this offense? At one point, he basically ran the same damn route 3 straight times, and they could not stop it. Now, the Rams did just trade a wide receiver, Van Jefferson, now in Atlanta, but he wasn't getting utilized in this offense anyway, not with Cooper Kupp coming back, with Puka Nacua and the way he's been playing, Tutu Atwell as well. They have plenty of big play options on this offense already, but by having them, it's going to keep Matthew Stafford in that top half of quarterbacks when it comes to fantasy football. Now, a matchup going up against the Arizona Cardinals, they allow 21.8 fantasy points per game. That's third most in the league. Overall, the Rams are fairly healthy, and for years I've said, if Cooper Kupp is active, then Matthew Stafford is fantasy viable. Then we add in the fact that we have Puka and Tutu as well, and a team that heavily focuses on the passing game in a good matchup at home. I think Matthew Stafford's going to be a top 12 option this week. But now we'll head over to the Jets and the Eagles. We'll start off with Jalen Hurts, the overall quarterback 2 right now, who's averaging 22.6 fantasy points per game, has multiple touchdowns in 4 straight games, 300 yards passing in back-to-back ball games, and 4 rushing touchdowns over the last 4 weeks of the season. Not to mention that, he's running a little bit more. He's had at least 10 rushing attempts in 3 of the last 4 ball games. Last week was a season high, 15 carries for 72 yards. Now they have a matchup going up against the Jets. They allow 15.8 fantasy points per game, but it's really hard to know what Jet defense is going to show up. Sometimes they are borderline dominant, but have been exploited on the ground here as of late. Now we know that Philadelphia for the most part is fairly healthy, and it's Jalen Hurts. We're never going to sit him anyway. This just may not be one of those high ceiling games that we would love to see. As for his opponent, it's Zach Wilson. We had Zach Wilson as a high risk against Denver. He sure as hell is going to be a high risk going up against Philadelphia on the road in Philadelphia. He only has 4 touchdowns through 5 games and has more turnovers than that. Zach Wilson, still not a fantasy option. How about the New York Giants and the Buffalo Bills next? We'll start off with Daniel Jones. And this is just another oh hell no. This team is an absolute dumpster fire. Buffalo's going to be back at home after playing in London last week and losing to the Jacksonville Jaguars. The offensive line in New York, they're either hurt or blocking their own teammates. And also, Daniel Jones himself is questionable to play with a neck injury. I'm not interested in Daniel Jones. I'm not interested in Tyrod Taylor. I don't care who they have at quarterback for the Giants. How about Josh Allen? Well, right now, very interested in Josh Allen. He's the number 1 overall quarterback in fantasy football, averaging 24.7 fantasy points per game, hasn't had less than 22 fantasy points in a game since week 1, and also has 8 touchdowns over the last 2 games. I can see Buffalo using this as kind of like a get-right game once again. The Giants allow over 16 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. The defense for the Bills is banged up, and that's leading to Josh Allen having to play from behind and throw the ball more each week. He also has both tight ends questionable right now, Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox questionable to play, so that's definitely something to pay attention to. We could be looking at another Gabe Davis week, but it's Josh Allen. We know we're never going to sit this guy. Which will then take us to Monday Night Football, last game of the week. Dallas Cowboys, Los Angeles Chargers. We'll start off with Dak Prescott. And is it time to start having some tough talks about Dak Prescott? He only has 1 game all year with multiple touchdowns. Just last week alone, he threw 3 interceptions. He's barely averaging over 212 yards passing a game and has a career low in air yards per attempt and yards per completion. Now, sure, he's faced some pretty difficult defenses here this season in San Francisco, New England, the Jets, but his play on the field just has not been great. The turnovers can be forgiven when you're racking up yards and touchdowns, but if you're not getting the yards and the touchdowns, woof. But this is not a bad matchup whatsoever. Going up against the Los Angeles Chargers, they allow almost 22 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That's 4th most in the league. And this defense, it continues to get beat up in Dallas, right? The offensive line is basically held together with an off-brand style of duct tape, but we have to look at this overall matchup as being a great matchup for Dak Prescott. In the 2 matchups the Chargers have had with competent passing offenses, they've allowed over 340 yards passing in each one of those games. It's just no longer safe for Dak Prescott. He's going to be reliant on these good matchups, and this could be one of them this week. His opponent, Justin Herbert. And welcome back off your bye there, Mr. Herbert. He's averaging 24.2 fantasy points per game, second most in fantasy football, and hasn't had less than 21 points in a game so far this year. He has multiple touchdowns in every game this season. We actually saw him with 12 rush attempts the week prior to the bye, which is absolutely crazy to see for Justin Herbert. But now he gets a matchup going up against Dallas, and on paper, very tough, right? 13.2 fantasy points per game allowed to opposing quarterbacks, but they hadn't been tested until last week with Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy went out and put up 252 yards passing, 4 touchdowns, no interceptions, and made it look easy. So really, this Dallas defense looks great on paper, but not when they're actually pressed against a high-powered offense, kind of like the one here in LA. But let's not forget, we're more than likely going to get Austin Eckler back this week, but Justin Herbert himself suffered an injury to his finger prior to the bye. All signs pointing to him being okay, but still something to pay attention to. This may not be some cream puff matchup where Justin Herbert's going to go score 40 points for you, but being at home, coming off his bye week with his weapon back in Austin Eckler, I'm not sitting Justin Herbert. All right, that's going to do it for my quarterback start and sit video here for week 6 fantasy football. Hopefully I was able to give you a little bit of information. Don't forget our rankings will be out on Thursday morning. But if you could do me a quick favor before we get out of here for the day, hit the like button if you haven't already, and then consider subscribing because we are dangerously close to 200,000 subscribers and would love to celebrate that with you guys here in 2023. I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day though. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day and then do your part to make the world a better place.